Today, we're diving into an absolutely epic story, the centuries-long struggle for India's independence. It's a massive saga that kicks off with trade but ends with a revolution. Really, it's the story of how a people fought to reclaim their own destiny.
I mean, think about that for a second. It sounds impossible, right? But this story, it doesn't start with armies and kings in the way you might think. Nope. It starts with merchants, with ships, all chasing spices and profits. And that right there sets up the second, and maybe even more powerful question. What does it actually take to stand up to a global empire and forge a new nation from the ground up? This is the story of that journey. Now, to help us navigate this huge, complex topic, we're actually going to use the table of contents from Rajiv Ahir's A Brief History of Modern India as our roadmap. It does a fantastic job of breaking this history down into really clear, distinct stages. So we're going to follow these stages, treating them like 5 acts in a grand historical drama. Let's raise the curtain on Act 1. So our story begins with the arrival of European powers, and their focus wasn't conquest, at least not at first. It was all about trade. But as you can guess, the balance of power was about to shift, and shift dramatically. And here's our main player, the British East India Company. It started out as just a business, with a royal charter to trade. But over time, it grew into something else entirely. It had its own army, it signed its own treaties, and it governed huge territories. It was a corporation that started acting like a country. So how on earth did a company get that powerful? Well, the company's advantages were just overwhelming. Sure, they had naval superiority and a disciplined modern army, but the real secret weapon, the critical difference maker, was financial. They had massive backing from a stable government back home, and they'd mastered using debt markets. What that means is they could fund these long, drawn-out campaigns and just plain out spend all their rivals. This mix of military and economic power, it turned out to be unstoppable. So for about a century, company rule just kept expanding across India. But underneath that surface, all this resentment was building up. And that brings us to Act 2, the moment when all that anger and frustration finally exploded into a massive open rebellion. This revolt, it didn't just come out of nowhere. It was a perfect storm. The causes were just layered, one on top of the other. Economically, traditional industries were being wiped out. Politically, Indian rulers were being pushed aside. Administratively, constant changes were causing total chaos. And on a deeper level, a socio-religious level, many people feared their entire way of life was under attack. Each one of these grievances just added more fuel to the fire. And then, in 1857, the spark finally hit that powder keg. This year marks the Great Revolt, a massive, widespread uprising against the East India Company. And this wasn't just some small mutiny, it was a firestorm that threatened to burn down the entire British enterprise in India. But here's the crucial takeaway. Even though the revolt was eventually put down, it changed everything. Back in London, the government decided the East India Company was just too reckless to manage an entire subcontinent. So they dissolved its ruling powers, and India was brought directly under the control of the British Crown. The era of company rule was over. The era of the British Raj had officially begun. The failure of the 1857 revolts taught a really harsh lesson. An armed rebellion against a modern military probably wasn't going to work. So the struggle had to evolve. And Act 3 is all about the birth of a new idea, the idea of India as a single modern nation. The battlefield basically moved from forts and open fields to newspapers, debating societies, and classrooms. This new generation of leaders, they understood that to challenge the British, they first had to forge a unified Indian identity. They had to make their case with political and economic arguments, not just guns. And there were several key things that fueled this new movement. You had social reformers challenging old traditions, which helped create a sense of shared progress. And ironically, it was the British infrastructure, things like railways, the telegraph, a single administrative system, that helped to unify the very country they were ruling. A vibrant press started spreading these new ideas, and then in 1885, all these currents flowed together to create the Indian National Congress. For the first time, the movement had an organized national platform. So, for its first few decades, the nationalist movement was largely made up of the educated elite. But in the 20th century, all of that changed big time. Let's move to Act 4 and see how the freedom struggle went from the drawing room to the streets, becoming a movement of millions. This timeline really shows a clear escalation. It started in 1885 with the moderates, who believed in writing petitions and trying to persuade the British. But by 1905, a much more assertive nationalism popped up with the Swadeshi movement, which called for boycotting British goods. But the real massive turning point came around 1919. This is when the era of mass nationalism truly begins, and that was largely thanks to one man. When Mahatma Gandhi came back to India, he completely transformed the struggle. His method of satyagraha, which he called truth force, a powerful form of nonviolent resistance, was absolutely radical. It gave everyday people, peasants, workers, women, students, a way to directly participate in the movement. Suddenly, the call for freedom wasn't just something you heard in the big cities, it was echoing in thousands of villages all across the subcontinent. So after decades of mass struggle, after 2 world wars, and just immense sacrifice, the end of British rule was finally in sight. This brings us to the final, climactic act of our story, a moment that is both a triumphant victory and a profound, heartbreaking tragedy. Yeah, the story of 1947 isn't a simple one. On one side, it was the absolute fulfillment of a dream, the end of an empire and the birth of a free India, a huge victory for the nationalist movement. But on the other side, it was a nightmare. The subcontinent was partitioned, creating the new nation of Pakistan. And this division meant a whole new struggle began for millions of people. It led to one of the largest and most violent migrations in human history, leaving scars that, honestly, are still felt to this day. And that leaves us here. The story of how India forged its freedom is such a powerful lesson in how history is made. But the legacy of that freedom and of the partition that came with it continues to shape the subcontinent today. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What will the next chapter of this incredible story look like?